Let's talk about the elephant in the room for just a minute. You may not know this, but the video tutorial that you're about to watch has been sitting on my computer forever. Seriously. It's been collecting dust because I have not had the time, the gumption, the energy, or the motivation to write the final couple of pages in the pattern that's going to accompany this quilt tutorial video. However, all of that changes today because the video is out there for you to watch. Hey friends, welcome back to my sewing room. My name is Becca, and in today's video, that's exactly what we're going to do is a tutorial to make the trellis garden quilt. I am really excited to share this with you. But before we do, I want to talk to you a little bit about the pattern. The pattern that is meant to accompany this tutorial video can be found in my Etsy shop, and it can also be found for free in the VIP download area for my VIP members on my website. If you're interested in signing up for all of that, that link will be in the description box down below, as will the VIP download area and the link to the pattern on the Etsy shop. Now let me talk to you about why I designed this quilt pattern. The idea that I had here was to help me showcase those big, beautiful prints that you don't know what to do with. Recently, I have discovered that I like some of Tula Pink's fabrics. Not all of them, but some of them. But I buy the fabric and then it sits on my shelf and collects dust because I don't know how to use it. I don't know how to cut into it. I'm terrified that if I cut into it, I'm going to mess up the cutting. I'm not going to get things lined up the right way. There's just so much going on in the print that it overwhelms my brain and paralyzes me. Maybe you can relate to that. So I thought, what if I gave myself the freedom to fussy cut out some of the animals from the Everglow line and put them into a quilt where that was the hero of the layout. Once I kind of had that in my head, I got to work in EQ8 and really pre-quilt. I think I did most of the designing on this in pre-quilt, laying everything out and figuring out what those blocks would look like. And boy, oh boy, once I saw that layout in pre-quilt, yeah, it was done in pre-quilt. Once I saw the layout done in pre-quilt, I could not wait to get this sewn together. I am hoping that this tutorial and pattern is something that inspires you to start working with some prints that have been on your shelf and you have been paralyzed at the fear of cutting them up or paralyzed at the fear of fussy cutting them. In the video tutorial, I'm going to share with you the tips and tricks that I use to actually do that fussy cutting, and then I'll show you how I sew the whole quilt together. And oh, by the way, I'm going to let you know I'm going to have this pattern available for 50% off for a limited time, and all of the details for that will be in the description box down below. So if you want to pick up this pattern, pick it up now before it goes back up to full price. So these are some of the blocks that I've made for this quilt, but don't worry, I'm not going to leave you behind. I'm definitely going to walk you through a step-by-step tutorial showing you exactly how to make this quilt block. The beautiful thing about this quilt pattern is once I sew all of these blocks together with the cornerstones and sashings, you're going to have a quilt that looks just like the one in the thumbnail, and I'm really excited about that. Before we dive into the block tutorial though, I want to give you some tips for how to prepare yourself for success. First off, you will be working with some smaller pieces here. So it is probably in your best interest to starch your fabric before you cut it. When you add sizing like Best Press or what's that one starch that they have at Walmart? I don't even remember. Doesn't matter. When you add starch to the fabric, you're going to add some body, and it's going to reduce the amount of flimsiness and stretch that's going to be in your fabric. So it's going to be a little bit easier to work with those smaller pieces. Number two, when you're working with this, you'll notice that these 4 points that go around the center square, this is really designed to be kind of like an underlay or like a photo mat for your hero fabric, which is what I'm calling the center print here. I found it was easier because of the way the fabric is going to be worked with directionally to use a solid or solid-like non-directional fabric for these pieces and your background. Plus, by working the solids in, it allowed the print that was in the middle just to shine even more. The nice thing about this quilt is it really is designed to allow you to feature those big, beautiful prints that maybe you have been paralyzed at working with. I know for Tula Pink, she's not exactly a fabric designer that I love everything of, but when I see something from her that I like, I love it. I bought this neon Everglow line. I think I got a 1 yard bundle, and I'm sure there's a couple of prints in here that I know I had more than a yard of, but I wasn't cutting into it because there was so much going on in the prints that it really kind of hurt my brain to think about cutting it. I was afraid I was going to cut off wrong segments and I wasn't going to be able to show the artwork that was in the fabric that really drew me to it. And that's why I dreamt up this pattern. Let me show you what I did to overcome that. So here's some yardage that I want to cut, and spoiler alert, I've already cut it. When I cut out the squares, all of the cutting instructions are in the pattern in the show notes down below, so you can go pick that up, but I want to let you know that my brain worked differently for each of these. When I'm looking at the elephants, these prints were so big that they took up almost all of the size that I needed for that square of fabric. So it was really easy to pull off a length of the fabric and come in with a template, a fussy cut template, or just a square ruler and put it over top of the element and cut out around that square. That made total sense to me, and I didn't feel like I was wasting anything because when I cut in to the fabric and I cut out an elephant, I wasn't disrupting another elephant nearby, so everything worked. But when it came to the hippos, this got to be a little bit more challenging for me. Every one of these stinking hippos is so cute, but they're not as big as the elephant, and they're kind of all over the place, and they're not even always spaced out evenly. So what I had to do is come in with my template, and I moved it around until I saw something underneath the square that I liked. Now remember, when I'm doing that, I have to be mindful of that 1/4 inch seam around all 4 sides of this square because I'm going to lose that fabric when I sew it into the block. Once I found a hippo that I wanted to feature, this is where my brain started to hurt. If I wanted to cut this piece out so that this hippo was dead center in my square, I was going to cut off this guy, and I probably wouldn't be able to use him in the center of another block. And then this guy down here is going to cut off his nose, so he probably couldn't be featured, at least in the center of a block. And that was causing me to spiral a little bit. So I had to give myself a little bit of freedom here to understand that by doing this, I am going to waste fabric. And when I say waste, I just mean that I can still use this for something else, but I probably won't be able to make a big fussy cut out of this for another project. Maybe small fussy cut, but definitely not a big one. Once I embraced that there is going to be waste from this process, it was a whole lot easier to cut. I just gave myself the freedom to run the rotary cutter, cut out the pieces that I need, and look, it wasn't actually as bad as I thought it was going to be. I've got one here with the hippo and the butterfly. You even have this little guy down at the bottom. This is the same one as over here, but he's just lowered a little bit, so it looks like he's swimming down a little bit lower. You can see I've still got plenty of hippos that once they're worked into the quilt, I think it's going to look great. So let me show you how to make this block. To make this block, you really don't need a whole lot of pieces, just these. Let's talk about what we see here first. Obviously, you have that really big piece of hero fabric right in the middle. But then you have these flying geese type of looking units that are around the 4 corners, and this is probably the most complex piece of the quilt, and it really just has to do with making sure that you know how to orient your background fabric and your matte fabric. There are a number of different ways that you could have constructed this, and I am sure if you are a seasoned quilter, your mind is already churning with all of the possibilities. I chose to make this all one strip because that reduced the bulk. It just required a little bit of thought process during construction. Now I've got 2 pairs of these units. I have 2 units that are the same size as the block, and then 2 units that are the same size as the squared up final size of the block. So 2 that are smaller and 2 that are bigger. To make that, we're going to grab all of our elements, and in the pattern, I'll tell you everything that you need to pull out, but let me just demonstrate how we're going to get there. To make the shorter sides, we're going to pull 4 shorter rectangles from our background. And to make the longer ones, we're going to pull 4 longer rectangles from our background. The shadow mat pieces are the same size for all 4 of those. We're going to do something very similar to what we would do when we're creating our binding strips. We're going to sew our fabric together so that we're making this turn into one continuous piece lengthwise. Not width, but length. And I hope I'm explaining that right. But to do it, I want to make sure that I have that 45-degree line, just like I would if I was binding. So the best way that I found works for me is to lay the fabric, the background fabric, on top of the square so that they're running perpendicular to one another. And I'm lining the fabric up along this edge and this edge. And then I'm just test flipping it in a couple of different ways to figure out how do I need to flip it up after it's sewn together to make that continuous run. And once I kind of figured it out, I just press it down with my finger a little bit, and that will give me a crease on the back of the fabric that I can mimic when I'm drawing my line. There are a number of different ways that you could do this, and I've made several of these blocks, as you saw earlier. I used diagonal seam tape, but I felt like my results were better when I marked my diagonal line. So to do that, I grab a ruler, I put the 45-degree line up right on the edge of that fabric, and then I make sure that the template or the ruler is coming right up at that corner that I want my diagonal line to start at. And I'm just going to draw that 45-degree line down. My fabric shifted a little bit, so let me just apply a little bit of pressure and redraw. I'm going to draw that 45-degree line all the way down, and now that I can see what angle that goes in, I'm going to do that on a second piece. I'm not going to get gung-ho and do this on all 4 pieces because the other 2 are going to need to be mirror image of that so that we get this flying geese type of shape. So I'm going to take those 2 pieces and 2 of my shadow mat pieces over to my sewing machine. I'm going to line them back up just in that same corner that I had tested out before, and I'm going to stitch just 1 thread next to that purple line. When you're putting this under your machine, make sure that all your raw edges of your fabric are absolutely lined up. Otherwise, you might get something that's not perfectly straight and flush after you've sewn them together. If you need to pop a couple pins in this before you sew, that is perfectly okay. Remember, these are smaller pieces that you're working with, so it could be a little bit more finicky than you're used to. After I've sewn them together, I'm going to put my finger in between the 2 pieces, and I'm just going to gently push that background piece over. I'm going to press it down with my fingers. What I want to see is that this raw edge of my shadow mat fabric extends over here. That fabric is nice and straight and it's lined up. If it's not, then I want to take it back to the sewing machine and do a little bit better of a job. Now, if you're off by just a thread or 2, you might still be okay as long as you're careful when you're constructing your block. But if it's off more than a couple of threads, you'll want to try to address that because otherwise you won't get these really pretty, nice, sharp points around your square, and you won't preserve enough space for your 1/4 inch when you assemble your blocks into your quilt. Once I have made sure that my fabric is flipped over correctly, then I can take this over here and trim a 1/4 inch away from that line, from that stitched line. I turn my iron on because I'm going to need it in a minute. And this is where the benefit of me making so many blocks before I started the tutorial is going to help you. Because what I was doing is just pressing them out and away. And I got a little bit of a shadow under here, which is okay. But this darker fabric sometimes was kind of bleeding behind this white background that I really liked. So then for a couple of blocks, I tried pressing the fabric underneath the darker piece, which was great. From a shadow perspective, this worked out well, but it added more bulk than what I liked. Certainly manageable, but I didn't want to deal with it. So my recommendation and what I've put in the pattern is to actually, for this step, when we're making these units, press this seam open. So I'm going to press this one open, and I'm going to press this one open. Now you can absolutely do whatever you would like as long as you are happy with the results. This isn't going to nest with anything else, so it doesn't have to be in a specific direction. I just felt like I got better results when I pressed those seams open, and that's my pro tip for you. Okay, my iron's heated up. I'm just gonna set it on top of that for a second. I apply nice dry iron to those pieces. It'll make it lay a little bit flatter, which is important for the next step. Look, they are exactly the same, but now we need to make that other 45-degree angle and extend more background off this side so that we have the unit that looks like this. So to do that, we're going to kind of repeat what we did just on the opposite side. We're going to take our two small rectangles of our background fabric and just practice flipping it to make sure that it creates that triangular shape that we like. And once it is, we'll just finger crease that so we can see the direction of that line. And once I have that done, I'm going to draw using my 45-degree line along one of the edges of the fabric, placing the ruler right where that point is, and drawing my line. And let me tell you why I did that really quick, because I realized I didn't explain it in the previous step. If I don't use the 45-degree line and line it up on the edge of the fabric, then I can't be sure that this line is going to be 45 degrees perfectly. See, if I take this rectangle, I could totally put the ruler so that it's starting in this corner and it's ending anywhere else on the block. But the way I'm going to make sure that that line is 45 degrees to this line and this line is by using a 45-degree line on my ruler, putting that right on that cut edge and sliding it down so that the ruler comes right out of that point. Then I'm going to be sure that this 45-degree line is replicated right here. This is a 45-degree angle, and that's exactly what I'm looking for. So it doesn't matter what ruler you use, as long as you have a 45-degree line on your ruler, and just about all of them have that. Once I know the direction that my lines are going to go and they're marked, I'm going to take these over to the sewing machine, and just like I did before, I'm going to stitch just one thread next to that drawn line. Make sure that as you're stitching these pieces together, you're just going one thread to the right of that marked line, and you're keeping control of the fabric so that it's going straight, and you're not doing anything to mess up the seam that you pressed open previously. And then just like we did before, we're going to test flip that over. And if we've got a nice straight line, I just eyeball this. I don't bring in anything to measure it to make sure it's perfectly straight. I'm just going to eyeball it. And if it looks like it's straight, then I'm going to call it good enough. I'll get my rotary cutter and ruler, trim a 1/4 inch away from that stitch. And we're going to press these seams open too. Or if you chose to go rogue and press out or under or whatever, do that again. Hot iron on top of it to get it flat just for a second. And there we have the two pieces that are going to go on the sides of our hero fabric. We're going to repeat all of that with the 4 larger background pieces and the 2 remaining shadow mat pieces. Yeah, I don't always know what I call these fabrics in the pattern when I'm recording the tutorial, because I finished the pattern after the tutorial's recorded, just so you know. Here is one where I have a bit of a boo-boo. You can see that this is going a little crooked. It's not straight with this edge here. It's definitely not lined up. And so that's more than I care to leave in there. I know from experience that is going to cause me a bit of wonkiness in my block. And I don't want my blocks to be off kilter like our friend Ian. I want them to be nice and straight and tidy. I don't want them to look drunk. So I'm going to take this back over to my sewing machine and I'm going to try it again. What I just showed you can also happen if you are not starting to stitch right in the corner of your pieces and ending right in the corner. And so sometimes when I see that happen, I'll actually find that it's because when I look on the back, my stitching didn't start and or end in the corners of the fabrics where they should have been. Now I've got all of the elements that I need to build out my block. This is so easy at this point. I'm just going to put a border around this guy. The shorter pieces go on the sides. I just need to make sure that when I'm laying out my border, I am putting the long side of that triangle of the mat up against the center square. I'm going to sew the short sides first, whether those are on the sides or the top and bottom, and then also the long sides. Let's put these right sides together and sew. You should find that your accent diamond sides, whatever we're going to call those, are the same length as your center square. If it's just a couple threads smaller or a couple threads bigger, you should be okay. But if it's anything more than that, you probably either miscut or may have messed up a little bit when you were sewing your background and your mat pieces, your shadow mat pieces together. So you might need to take a look at what you did here and revisit that step. Once these are sewn together, it doesn't matter which way you press this. You can press it underneath here, you can press it underneath here, you can press it open. It's really quilter's choice at this point. These seams are not going to nest with anything else, so I just let the fabric tell me where it wants to go. In this case, the fabric wants to hang out with the elephant, so I'm going to finger press it underneath the center block. And when I say I let the fabric tell me where it wants to go, I'm just going with the natural fold. Like, how is the fabric tending to lay after it came off of the sewing machine? It's not actually talking to me. Once those pieces are put on, we'll do our top and bottom. And now these units should be the same size as the width of this. If they're off by just a couple of threads, you should still be okay. But if it's anything more than, I would say, a 1/16 of an inch, you might want to take a look at what you're doing. Within a 1/16 of an inch, you can definitely work it in. If it is just a little bit shorter, just make sure that this and this is kind of eyeballed, evenly distributed along the top and bottom. And oh, by the way, if you did have a piece where this was not perfectly flush, this was not perfectly straight, then what you're going to find here is that you might have something that looks like this. I'm going to try and fudge it when you put it together, meaning over here, everything's nice and lined up. But when you get over here, this might be maybe lined up, but this is going to poke through. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're going. If you had one that was a little cattywampus, you might have a couple threads of the hero fabric poking through down below. Once our top and bottoms are on, we can press it whatever direction the block is telling us it wants to go. This case felt like it wanted to go underneath the top and bottom borders, so we're just going to press it over with our hands, grab our iron, and just apply some dry heat right to those seams to get it to lay nice and flat, because our next step is to square this block up before we add our snowballed corners. And the reason why I do that now is because I want to make sure that these four corners are the size they need to be and they're 90 degrees. So I'm going to show you how I square this block up. When I'm doing this, I don't always use a square ruler. If my trusty 8.5 by 12 inch Quilter Select ruler can measure the block and do the square, I'm going to go for that. I can pretty much do most of my cutting, squaring and everything with this one ruler. You don't need to have all of them, but sometimes it is helpful. If you have a square ruler and you want to grab it, that's totally fine too. Here's what I do. I find the 45-degree line on my ruler again, and I'm going to lay it so that that 45-degree line is starting in one corner of that hero fabric and it is ending in the opposite corner of that hero fabric. Then I'm going to refer to the pattern for what size I'm going to measure this to or square it up to, and I'm going to make sure that I can square the block to that size. The other thing that I'm going to pay attention to are these 4 points from that shadow mat. I want to make sure that I've got about a 1/4 inch of an area between where that point is and where I'm going to square the block up to. And as long as those couple of things are aligned with one another, I should be good. Now, my ruler actually has 2 45-degree lines. They're kind of doing a crisscross applesauce type of thing. So I could see dead center where that block's going to be, which is kind of neat. But that allows me to also make sure that I can double check that the 45-degree line is starting in this corner, ending here, starting in this corner, and ending down here so that my block is perfectly straight. Now, why do those 45-degree lines matter? Well, because those 45-degree lines are going to be what keeps your hero fabric looking straight. If I were to cut this without paying attention to how this square fabric was laid, I could just a little bit skew it, and then what might happen is this block might be straight, but then this one might look a little tilted in the quilt. Now, if you're looking for a cattywampus kind of wibbly wobbly quilt, then there you go. But that's not what I want. I want them to look nice and tidy and clean and straight. So that's why I'm paying very close attention to that 45-degree line, or 2, or 3. I guess you wouldn't really have 3, but you could have 2. Once you're sure of the position of your ruler all the way around, then you can come in, clean it up. You might not get much off. You might just get a couple of threads, but better safe than sorry. Turn it around, line it back up again, making sure your 45-degree lines are here. And this time, those nice clean edges should be right at the measurement that I'm squaring to. Not much taking off at all, but I have confidence that this is the size I need it to be. Now, the last step is to snowball these 4 corners, and you've done this before. It's a stitch and flip. To do a stitch and flip, we're just going to draw a line in each of these 4 pieces of fabric from one corner down to the other. You can, of course, use some diagonal seam tape if you want to skip this, but like I said, I haven't been using it lately, and so I feel like my results are not as pristine with that diagonal seam tape as they could or should be if I had been practicing with it. And so I'm just choosing to mark all of these fabrics because I want it to look as close to perfect as it can. It's not going to be perfect. There will be mistakes, but I don't mind taking a couple extra seconds to yield a little bit better results for this. Let's go sew. And then I'm going to flip and test to make sure that my stitch and flip was right. What I'm going to do is, just like I did before, I'm going to put my finger in between the 2 layers and gently nudge that stitched piece over. And what I'm looking for in this case is to make sure that this flap that I folded up and over is completing that 90-degree corner perfectly. It's covering that up. If I find that this piece is too small, it's not coming all the way up here, that means either the entire length or somewhere along this line I was too far to the left of the line that I drew. But if I found that it goes beyond, and from the back side I have more of the flip than I do of what was going to be trimmed off, that means I was too far to the right of that line. So adjust if needed. Again, if you're a thread or 2 off, no big deal. You're looking for Close enough. Within a couple of threads is always close enough, unless you're a show quilt, at which point maybe you need it perfect. Once I'm satisfied with my flip, I'm going to trim these. And by the way, when you were stitching that line down on your snowballs, you could have always taken a second seam about a 1/2 inch or so, eyeball it of course, away from where you just stitched. That way, as you're cutting these pieces off, you could be producing very small 1/2 square triangle units that you could use in a different project. I'm not worried about producing a little bit of waste here. These are solid fabrics that are not highly coveted. I have plenty of this yardage in my stash. I even have it by the bolt, so I'm okay discarding that. Once my block is all sewn together, I'm going to give it one final press. And to do that, I want to use my starch to give it just a little bit more body. So if you're keeping track, I starched the fabric before I cut it. I did all of the sewing together with a hot dry iron. And now at the final end of this block construction, now I'm going to starch it one more time. Before I do, I'm going to finger press all of my seams down. I'm going to pat this nice and flat with my hands to make sure it's square, it looks good. And then I'm going to grab my mister bottle. I'm going to put a little bit of best press on there, and then I'm just going to pat this down so it's laying flat and it's ready for some heat. I'm not going to iron this block. I am going to press it. And by the way, when I pressed this down, I was not tugging the fabric. I was just pushing it down so it was laying flat. I'm going to come in with my iron and I'm just going to set it on top of that fabric for a few seconds to let it heat up the fabric and evaporate the starch that's underneath. I don't want to leave it there too long because I don't want to scorch my fabric. Just a couple of seconds is long enough. And I'm kind of over exaggerating this press action right now because I want you to see that I am not moving the iron over top of the fabric. I'm not pushing the fabric with the iron at all. Normally when I'm pressing, if you're watching me in my videos, you might see me do something that looks like this, and it might look like I'm pushing the iron on my fabric. I'm not. I'm actually lifting it up just a breath, just enough that I can pick it up and move it over to the other section. So don't always buy what you see on TV. It's not always what it appears to be. Once you've pressed this block, you should have a nice block that is substantial to hold. It shouldn't have a lot of wumpiness and it shouldn't have a lot of stretch to it. You're going to make 30 of those and then we're going to put them together into the quilt top. I have all of my blocks pieced together and I want to show you how we're going to make our horizontal sashing strips. They're going to be used to combine all of our rows of blocks. So we'll get to putting the blocks together in just a moment. Let me show you how to make those horizontal sashing strips. So you should have a pile of sashing strips. These are the same size. They are used for the vertical sashing in between your blocks, as well as the horizontal sashing that's going to go in between your rows. You're going to need to make 5 of these units, and these 5 horizontal sashing rows are going to be consisted of 5 horizontal sashing pieces, each separated by a cornerstone. So you should have 4 cornerstone units in that row and 5 of these horizontal sashing pieces. It should start and end with a horizontal sashing piece. When we put this together, we're going to press our seams underneath our cornerstone row our cornerstone fabric, because that's going to allow us to nest our seams together when we sew this in between the rows of blocks. So I'm going to go make all of these, and then I'm going to show you how to lay out the quilt. I don't have a design wall in my room, and I'm actually okay with that, but that means that when it's time to lay out a quilt and audition block placement, I do got to go to the floor. So I have all of my blocks laid out the way I want them to be. I use the floor to kind of get them in the right order. And then once that's done, I can start sewing this together. Because I've laid them out in the order that they're going to be sewn together, it's going to allow me to kind of keep my blocks organized. And I got to point this out. Maybe you see it, maybe you don't yet. Once you start adding the sashing to these blocks, that's where that lattice design is really going to start to pop. And I just absolutely love that about this quilt. So what did you think? Not a bad project, right? This is definitely a fun sew. I do think it is beginner friendly, and it's something that if you buckle down, I feel like you could even do in a weekend. Don't forget that pattern is 50% off for a limited time, and all the details will be in the description box down below. Thank you, friends, for hanging out with me, checking out this tutorial video, and leave me a comment down below. Let me know if you're going to make this. I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye!